The air above the cypress swamp in Edgefield County, South Carolina, hung thick and viscous, a suffocating blanket of moisture and decay. It was the heavy, sweet rot of pine needles drowned in stagnant water, the metallic stench of iron-rich mud, and overlaying it all, the indelible copper tang of fresh death. This was the first immediate sensation that gripped the search party, not the sight of the horror, but the unavoidable cloying aroma of the end of many men. When they finally broke through the dense curtain of Spanish moss and saw the glade, the silence was what stopped them first. It was an unnatural silence, not the quiet of the wilderness, but the profound, echoing void left when screaming has been utterly extinguished. The bodies were laid out in a semicircle around the burnt foundations of a small shack, each one meticulously stripped of its hood and robe. They were arrayed with a careful, almost architectural precision. The flies were already working, a buzzing, sickening crown above the pale, bloated faces. Captain Elias Vance, a veteran of Sharpsburg and a man accustomed to the sight of mass carnage, felt the gorge rise in his throat. He counted the immediate area, 11. But his Corporal Jackson, sweating profusely despite the cool morning, gestured toward the shadows of the palmetto thicket. There were more there, and then more, half submerged in the bog, lashed to broken saplings. The final tally, taken over 3 excruciating hours under the rising sun of October 1868, defied mathematics and sanity. 57 corpses, all men, all members of the local Pale Order, the men who terrorized the newly freed population, and they had all been executed within the space of 24 hours. This was the brutal, unyielding paradox of the Reaper's Day. 57 men, armed, organized, experienced in violence, trained in terror, and mounted on strong horses, had been extinguished by a single agent of vengeance. A freed woman, recently escaped from the specific violence they had inflicted upon her, a woman whose name, if they whispered it at all, was simply Clara. It was not a fight. The forensic evidence, though crude in the 1868 swamp, screamed a different word: extermination. Look closer at the wounds. Rifles were found, mostly discharged once or twice, sometimes dropped, sometimes still clutched in hands, rigor mortised into uselessness. But the fatal wounds were not from distant shots. They were up close, throats cut with surgical precision, skulls crushed by blunt force applied with impossible strength, necks snapped with a torque that suggested mechanical leverage, not human hands. And in several cases, the bodies were perforated by hardened wooden spikes, driven with the clean, deep penetration of a well-set trap. 28 rifles against the desperation of hands previously deemed property. 28 trained hunters against one woman whose only training was endurance and survival. When the coroner, a reluctant, nervous physician brought in from Charleston, surveyed the scene, he confirmed the impossible sequence. The execution began at dusk on the previous day and concluded just before dawn. 57 men, eliminated systematically, moving across a 5-mile area of swamp, pine forest, and abandoned rice fields. This was not a story of flight. It was the documentation of an organized, brutal annihilation. The South Carolina Low Country in the Reconstruction era was already a crucible of misery. The war was over, but the conflict had merely changed clothes. The plantation system had been replaced by crop lien, and the slave patrols by the ghostly, hooded riders of the Ku Klux Klan. This was a land of constant anxiety, where the promise of freedom was immediately challenged by nightly terror. The environment itself was hostile. The dense undergrowth, the ubiquitous mosquitoes, the humid air that made every breath an effort, and the black, silty water that hid snakes and alligators. The swamp was a character, a vast, indifferent beast. Soon, it would become Clara's accomplice. Clara had been known for her quietude. On the Old Thorn plantation, she was the head cook, a position that demanded strength and meticulous organization. Her physicality was remarked upon only in whispers, a height unusual for women of her generation, and hands calloused not just from cooking, but from years of labor in the fields whenever the kitchen needed less than her. She had endured the whip, the auctions, the endless grinding subservience. Yet she survived. She learned to listen to the whispers of the wind, the subtle shifts in the cypress knees, the sound of a horse approaching before the sound was fully formed. She was considered a survivor, never a fighter. That assessment changed on the night of Tuesday, October 13th. Clara and her husband, Matthew, had staked a claim on 40 acres of marginal land bordering the swamp. They had built a simple shack. They had a future. It was this meager future the pale order came to extinguish. The riders arrived around midnight, 30 strong, the flickering torchlight reflecting sickeningly on their white robes. They dragged Matthew out first. "You uppity Negro!" The leader, Deputy Sheriff Thomas Hale, spat, his voice distorted by the linen mask. "You think you deserve land? You think you deserve a name?" Matthew's refusal to grovel was the immediate spark. He fought. He was swiftly overwhelmed, beaten, and then, slowly, deliberately, his shack was set ablaze around him. Clara watched from the shadows of the adjacent forest line, held back by a force of self-preservation that had defined her entire life. For a moment she was the silent, obedient observer, the property enduring the destruction of her possessions. But when Matthew's scream finally became just a hiss of final breath, the mechanism of endurance shattered. It was a rupture as violent and absolute as a bolt of lightning splitting a century-old oak. Clara's physical transformation was terrifyingly immediate. Her posture, usually subtly deferential, snapped rigidly erect. Her eyes, moments before filled with the vacant terror of the victim, went utterly blank, predatory, devoid of recognizable emotion. Her breathing, previously ragged and gasping, slowed to a shallow, unnerving control. The silence that fell over her was the silence of a hammer waiting to strike. The first execution happened 5 minutes later. Hale, pleased with the destruction, had sent 3 riders to scout the perimeter for potential witnesses. They were arrogant, laughing about the ease of their work. Clara moved out of the thicket with the fluid, soundless economy of a marsh cat. She had armed herself with the only item close at hand, a rusted iron axle pin, discarded by a broken wagon months before. It weighed maybe 5 pounds, dense and heavy, sharpened to a dull, brutal point by years of abrasion. The first rider, a young man named Billy Joe, lagged slightly behind his companions. He was adjusting his hood, his attention elsewhere. Clara did not run, she simply closed the distance. The axle pin struck the back of his skull, just behind the ear. The sound was not the wet impact of flesh, but a sickening, dry thud, the sound of dense metal meeting bone that immediately surrendered. Billy Joe collapsed off his horse without a sound, his spine and neck instantly disconnected from his brain. The pin remained lodged deep. Clara did not hesitate. She wrenched the pin free, covered in thick, warm gore, and moved to the horse. It was a well-trained animal, accustomed to stillness during terror. She calmed it with a hand learned through years of handling stubborn mules, and led it silently into the denser forest, away from the path. The next 2 riders, noticing their partner's absence, began to backtrack, calling his name softly. Clara waited. The darkness and the heavy canopy were her shield. When the second man passed within 3 feet of her position, she moved, not for his weapon, but for his windpipe. Her arm wrapped around his neck. The immense, sudden pressure of her forearm was lethal. She did not choke him. She compressed the larynx until the trachea pulverized. The man dropped silent, his hands clawing uselessly at his throat. The third rider stopped his horse, alarmed by the sudden, thick silence behind him. He heard a whisper of movement, turned his mount, and then the iron pin, now slick and heavy, was thrown, not at him, but at his horse's exposed eye socket. The animal screamed, a sound of agony and terror, rearing instantly. The rider was thrown violently onto the hard, unyielding roots below. Clara walked calmly to the dazed, paralyzed man. She took his heavy .58 caliber rifle, checked the load, and then, using the weight of the stock, ended the encounter. 4 KKK members were eliminated in less than 10 minutes. The weapons and resources had been acquired. The transformation was complete. It was not a desperate escape she initiated, but a tactical withdrawal into a planned hunting ground. The initial group of riders, hearing the horse scream and then the profound return to silence, gathered near the burning shack, momentarily confused. They attributed the scream to an accident. They looked around for signs of the woman they had seen fleeing earlier. Where did she go? The swamp. She ran to the swamp. This was their fatal arrogance. How could she have transformed a rusted axle pin into an instrument of such devastating silent death? The investigator who later found the weapon only noted the pattern of the impact. Consistent, efficient. Why had the 3 veteran hunting dogs brought along later by the search party refused to follow past the thicket where the first bodies were found, whining and dragging their chains? What was the meaning of the small, almost imperceptible scratch marks left on the side of a cypress tree? Were they trail markers or a calendar? Where did the tactical, methodical knowledge displayed in the ambush come from, considering this woman had only ever been regarded as property? And why did the oppressive silence of the dense bayou seem so artificial, so practiced, as if the entire forest held its breath for the executioner? The remaining members of the Pale Order, furious and emboldened by the recent act of terror, decided to pursue. Deputy Sheriff Thomas Hale, a barrel-chested man whose reputation rested on swift brutality, a former Confederate cavalry captain, took command of the initial pursuit. He assembled 19 men. 19 men, eager for the blood and the reward for bringing the escaped woman back, dead or alive. She's frightened, she's wet, and she's lost, Hale boomed, adjusting his ghostly hood. She's run into the muck. We corner her, we find her, and we make an example of her for the whole damn county. Nobody outruns the Pale Order, especially not a piece of property. Hale designated 3 teams. The first, 6 riders led by a tracker named Boone, specialized in following signs through the wet undergrowth. The second, 5 men, including the dog handlers. The third, led by Hale himself, a heavier force meant to intercept the prey once she was flushed out. Boone's team entered the dense swamp area first, near the abandoned rice fields. They were confident, their rifles loaded, their knives honed. They knew this territory. Their confidence lasted exactly 35 minutes. The first death in this wave was silent and almost invisible. Corporal Boone was leading his men through a stretch of thick marsh where the water reached the horses' bellies. He rounded a cluster of mossy palmettos. When the next man, Corporal Davies, looked up, Boone was gone. His horse, panicked but controlled, was standing still, only its head visible above the dense reeds. They found Boone's body 20 minutes later, submerged just below the waterline. He had not drowned. An improvised spear, made from a sharp cypress knee and hardened over a quick fire, had been driven upward through the soft tissue beneath his jaw, piercing the brainstem instantly. The water had washed away the blood, leaving the wound clean and devastatingly efficient. "Accident!" Hale roared when the news reached him by runner an hour later. "Stupid bastard fell off his horse and landed on a broken branch. Keep moving. She's trying to stall us." The next 2 deaths happened simultaneously, miles apart, proof of Clara's planning and foresight. The team with the dogs found their fate near a dry creek bed. The hounds, already nervous, suddenly veered away from the creek, pulling against their handlers. The handlers, 2 brothers named Prentice and Clay, whipped the dogs back toward the water. They never reached it. Clara had engineered a deadfall trap, a heavy, rotting log, perfectly balanced and braced with a thin, almost invisible vine made from woven Spanish moss. When Prentice stumbled over the vine, the log was released. It struck both men from above, shattering their pelvises and ribs with a single massive blow. They lay crushed, unable to move, moaning softly. Clara did not appear immediately. She waited for the sounds of their pain to attract their remaining companions. But the screams were muffled by the dense humidity and the distant wind. It took 4 hours for the 2 remaining members of that dog team to find Prentice and Clay, crushed and nearly dead, but still alive. As the 2 rescuers knelt to aid them, 2 well-aimed shots rang out from the tree line. Shots fired from the stolen .58 caliber rifle, now used with expert precision. 4 men down in the second wave. The survivors were starting to feel the shift. They weren't hunting a terrified woman. They were navigating a battlefield built specifically for their destruction. By late afternoon, the original group of 19 men was reduced to 12. They were no longer moving swiftly. They were huddled, paranoid, checking every shadow. Hale was visibly enraged, his face flushed beneath the linen mask. "This is organized," muttered Deputy Vance, who was now traveling directly with Hale. "She's running us in circles. We passed this swamp oak an hour ago." Hale dismissed him. "Just bad tracking. The damn woods play tricks." But then they found the body of Corporal Davies, the man who had followed Boone. Davies was sitting upright against a massive cypress trunk. His face was frozen in a silent, wide-eyed scream. He had died not from a physical wound, but from acute psychological trauma. He was bound, not with rope, but meticulously wrapped in his own white clan robe, the fabric tightened so fiercely around his neck and chest that it looked like mummification. Affixed to his chest, pinned by a splinter of burnt wood, was a small, tattered piece of parchment. It was the deed to the 40 acres, the land they had burned. On the back of the deed, written in the meticulous, steady hand of a woman who had learned to write in secret, there were 2 words scored deep into the paper with the point of the iron axle pin: 57. The number was not a threat of the future. It was a progress report. It was the moment the remaining hunters realized that Clara was not hiding, nor was she fleeing. She was gathering them, she was processing them, and she had a quota. They had volunteered for a systematic extermination. This territory was not an escape route. It was now a personal matadero. The hunt had truly inverted, and the darkness was just beginning to fall again. The silence that followed the initial burst of powder and panic was heavier than the humid air, settling over the South Carolina lowcountry like a shroud woven from thick moss and ancient dread. The men who pursued her were 31 strong, drawn from 3 counties, veterans of war and violence, all wearing the white linen masks that symbolized their immunity to justice. They believed they hunted property. They were instead entering an abattoir designed and engineered by their own cruelty. They were led by Captain Silas Vance, a man whose reputation preceded him like the stench of unwashed blood. Vance had hunted men and women across the Carolinas for 2 decades, a grim architect of human misery. He viewed the woods, the canebrakes, and the stagnant deep-water sloughs not as obstacles, but as extensions of his own will. His contingent, consisting of 12 of the most brutal enforcers, carried Spencer rifles, heavy repeating pistols, and chillingly sharpened tools designed not for killing but for coercion: pliers, branding irons, and lengths of newly forged chain. The hubris was thick enough to chew. "She's running blind now, boys," Vance had growled, spitting tobacco juice onto the dark mud near the cypress knee, where Clara's initial stand had occurred. A rabbit panicked by the hounds. "She's got a good 2-mile lead, maybe 3. She'll head for the deep bayou, trying to lose the scent in the cypress muck. She's only a woman, scared and fast. We'll be done by sundown." They moved too quickly, relying on the dogs, a specialized pack of curs trained to ignore the scent of muskrat or deer and focus only on the panicked human smell. The group was loud, crashing through the undergrowth, their confidence a booming drumbeat that deafened them to the subtle shifts in the environment. They expected a struggle, a final desperate plea, maybe a poorly aimed shot from a stolen rifle. They expected a hunt. They were granted an extinction. The first 3 men to fall never saw her. They died not by bullet or blade, but by physics and patience. Jedediah Crow, a large man prone to complaining, lagged behind the main group to adjust his bootstrap. He took a shortcut through a patch of seemingly firm canebrake. They found him 2 hours later. He was impaled on a sharpened heart-pine stake, driven upward through his groin and into his torso. It was not a haphazard weapon. The stake was fire-hardened, surgically aligned with a game trail, and perfectly concealed beneath a thin layer of Spanish moss and floating detritus. His rifle lay untouched beside him. Vance, examining the unnatural wound, the clean perforation, the immediate bloodless death, dismissed it. Greenhorn stupidity. Stepped on an old Indian trap. Keep moving. Her scent is still fresh, but the dogs disagreed. The pack, usually howling maniacally for the chase, grew sullen and hesitant. They would follow the scent for a short distance, then stop abruptly whining, their attention fixed on the dense, unmoving swamp ahead. They refused to cross a specific shallow creek, their tails tucked tight against their flanks. Vance's whipping did nothing but elicit terrified yelps. He pushed the men forward anyway, convinced the swamp itself was confusing the animals. Hours later, the second loss occurred. Tom and Billy Jenkins, brothers renowned for their cruelty, insisted on skirting a stagnant pond that reeked of sulfur and decay. They vanished silently. Their panicked splashing was muffled entirely by the thick cypress canopy. When the remaining men reached the edge, they saw only the gentle ripple of the water closing over an air pocket. The edges of the pond, which appeared solid, were in fact a lethal, highly unstable bog, engineered for collapse under heavy weight. Clara had spent time there. She had identified the weakest points and, judging by the subtle signs, had worked to destabilize the perimeter with deliberate underwater manipulation. It was terrain management weaponized. 4 men gone, and the main group had not even seen her shadow. The men began whispering, the arrogant dialogues replaced by accusations. They found a fire pit, barely used, still smoking faintly beneath a mound of damp leaves. It was near the highest, driest point in that part of the swamp, a tactical observation post. Beside the pit, driven deep into the trunk of a water oak, was the handle of an axe. It was Silas Vance's personal military-issue hatchet, stolen hours earlier. But it wasn't the theft that chilled them. It was what was carved crudely into the wood. Not a mark of fear or a prayer. It was a single, deep, deliberate tally mark. Vance stared at the mark, the air suddenly thin in his lungs. This wasn't a desperate fugitive running. It was a hunter keeping count. "She's not lost," whispered Elias, the youngest man, his voice tight with rising terror. "She's calculating." Vance silenced him with a backhand, but the authority was cracking. He had lost 3 men to accidents, yet the evidence suggested that she was setting the pace, marking the moments. The second wave of attrition was marked by a shift from passive traps to active ambushes, demonstrating an escalating intimacy with the tactics of her pursuers. The remaining group of 27 men became jumpy, firing indiscriminately into the cane. They were no longer walking into traps, they were being pulled into them. Pryor, the designated tracker, was eliminated next. He was highly alert, scanning the high branches for snipers. He missed the danger at ground level. As he stepped over a fallen log, a heavy iron counterweight, likely repurposed from a dismantled cotton press, weighing near 80 pounds, swung horizontally from the dense underbrush, driven by a system of vines and levers. It struck Pryor mid-chest. The resulting sound was the wet, dull thud of ribs compressing into the heart. He was thrown 10 feet, his spine snapped clean, his rifle still warm in his grasp. The precision required to calculate the pendulum arc, the trigger delay, and the striking height was immense. This was not the work of a frightened woman. It was the engineering of someone who understood leverage, momentum, and biological weaknesses. The group began to fragment. Vance, now realizing they were traversing a labyrinth designed for their destruction, tried to rally them into tighter formations. But the sight of the iron counterweight, a grotesque symbol of the labor system that had marked Clara, broke their resolve. They saw her then. It was fleeting. a shadow among the shadows, moving against the light, a flicker of dark skin against the white of the cypress trunks. She appeared taller than they expected, the muscles developed by decades of forced labor evident in the swift, quiet way she moved. Her gaze, seen only by the terrified Private Denton before Denton lost control and emptied his rifle harmlessly into the moss, was utterly devoid of human emotion. Denton described it later, before he too succumbed to the swamp fever of fear. Her eyes were empty things, like polished wood, no light, no panic, just watching. Clara began using the weapons of the dead against the living. Patrol 3, separating to sweep a wide patch of pine forest bordering the swamp, suddenly found themselves under fire. 3 quick, expertly placed shots from a Spencer rifle, one they knew belonged to the deceased Jedediah. The distance was extreme, the angle precise, aimed not at the chest but at the hips and knees, dropping the men slowly into the mud. The survivors of Patrol 3 fled back to Vance, hysterical, confirming the impossible. She was armed, she was stalking them, and she could shoot better than they could. The environment, once neutral, became Clara's active confederate. A sudden, localized fog bank rolled in from the deepest part of the swamp, concealing her movements perfectly during the ambush. When the terrified remnants of Patrol 3 stumbled back to the main group, a torrential, brief downpour erupted, washing away every footprint and scattering the remaining scents, leaving the hunters stranded in a suddenly featureless, wet hell. The dynamic shattered. Arguments escalated into shoving matches. 2 men, convinced Vance was leading them to their deaths, tried to desert, turning back toward the known safety of the drier lands. They didn't make it a quarter mile. Their screams were choked and quick. They were found impaled on the jagged tines of broken, buried harrow teeth, their chests torn open. They had been executed as a warning to the rest. Fear displaced all training. They were no longer skilled hunters. They were terrified men, huddled against the deepening gloom, their expensive rifles feeling useless against an enemy that moved like water and struck like stone. Late in the day, cramped under a stand of twisted mangroves, Vance's dwindling patrol stumbled upon a shocking discovery. A series of dried clay figurines, crudely shaped like the hooded figures of the clan, positioned deliberately around a small, still pool of water. Each figure was marked with a tiny, precise perforation, as if staked. And next to the figurines lay a small, meticulously organized cache of supplies. Dry tinder, a water bladder full of fresh water, and a handful of dried roots known for their medicinal and analgesic properties. This was the proof. This was not the random result of a chase. This was not survival. The realization hit Vance with the force of a physical blow. The 40 square miles of low-country swamp they had entered had been systematically mapped, marked, and converted into an execution matrix. Clara had not been reacting to their presence. She had anticipated it. She had prepared for it. They had entered voluntarily, arrogant and armed, into her pre-established kill zone. It was not a desperate flight. It was a siege, and they were the encircled. By dusk, only 5 men remained with Silas Vance. The air was heavy, not just with humidity, but with the metallic scent of fear and the cloying sweetness of blood drying in the muck. They clustered tightly, rifles pointed outward, twitching at every croak of a frog, every rustle of dry leaves. Rationality was destroyed. They were waiting for the inevitable. She gave them little time to wait. The attack came not from the front or the side, but from above. A horrifying descent from the thick canopy where she'd been watching them for hours. The first man, Jeb, didn't even have time to scream. A repurposed cane knife, heavy and razor-sharp, descended with impossible speed, burying itself deep into the occipital bone at the base of his skull. The sound was a quick, wet chop. Jeb collapsed instantly, his death instantaneous and silent, his limbs going slack. The remaining four panicked, firing wildly. Clara, already moving with the fluidity of a predator whose muscles knew exactly when to contract and expand, dropped behind a fallen log, impervious to the poorly aimed shots. She eliminated the next two men in a horrifyingly precise blur. Using their confusion, she charged forward. She moved with a speed that defied her visible scars and the assumed limitations of her body. One man, trying desperately to chamber a round, had his arm wrenched back and broken with a sickening crack, the bone visible beneath the ripped fabric before Clara extinguished the light in his eyes with the heel of her boot. The other, paralyzed by the horror, was silenced when she used his own bayonet, recovered from the mud, driving it through his lower abdomen and twisting. Executions, not fights. Silas Vance was left alone with one surviving patrolman, Marcus. Marcus made a suicidal run for the open swamp. He was felled not by a weapon, but by the relentless, brutal strength of her pursuit. Clara caught him, dragging him back by his collar, crushing his shoulder against a tree trunk. She looked at Vance, her face expressionless, the only discernible feature being the relentless, terrifying control of her breath. Then, with an inhuman effort, she snapped Marcus's neck against the tree. Silas Vance, captain of the patrol, the man who had ordered dozens of lynchings and overseen untold acts of torture, was disarmed methodically. Clara used the butt of Jeb's rifle to smash the trigger mechanism of Vance's pistol, rendering it useless. Then she tossed the weapon away. Vance stood paralyzed, facing the woman he had dismissed as property. The fire in the swamp had been extinguished, replaced by a cold, methodical focus. Clara did not kill him quickly. She had been hunted, beaten, and chained for years. She reached down and retrieved the length of heavy chain Vance had brought specifically for the capture, the links still shiny and cold. She approached him slowly, allowing him to see the full measure of his vulnerability, his entire life of privileged violence collapsing into one agonizing moment of terror. She did not raise her voice. She did not make a sound of struggle. The chain was wrapped once, then twice around his throat. It was the same chain, or one exactly like it, that had marked the beginning and the end of her servitude. The death was not explosive or messy. It was a slow, deliberate extinction. Vance clawed at the metal, his face turning a sickening deep purple. The sound he made was a desperate, wet gurgle that the oppressive air immediately swallowed. He was forced to die by the very symbol of his oppression, his eyes bulging wide as the woman he hunted stood over him, absolutely silent, absolutely finished. When the last gurgle faded and Vance's body collapsed into the mire, the swamp achieved an unnatural quiet. It was a silence deeper than the night, a chilling absolute vacuum where the sounds of suffering had been violently erased. The clock had run, and the number had grown. A second group of reinforcements, 26 men strong and led by Sheriff Josiah Hale, arrived 48 hours later, alerted by the failure of the first patrol to report back. They found the scene by the smell. The discovery was less a crime scene and more a geological survey of systematic destruction. Hale, a man accustomed to violence, stopped dead at the edge of the perimeter. 17 bodies lay scattered across the swamp floor, those who had perished in the 3 waves. Each death was distinct, a specific method applied to a specific man. The wounds bore no sign of struggle, no chaotic exchange. They were precise. Hale, leaning close to examine Silas Vance's contorted face, noted the meticulous positioning of the bodies. They were not haphazardly left. They were executed and then positioned, facing the deep swamp, a chilling, unspoken warning. The iron chain was still embedded in Vance's neck, pulled so tight that the links had cut into the cartilage. "Look at this," Hale muttered, his voice raw. He pointed to the remains of the cotton press counterweight, still smeared with Pryor's blood. This wasn't a skirmish. This was preparation. The experienced investigators of Hale's group were rendered mute. They noted the lack of footprints other than the panicked ones of the victims and the large, deliberately placed steps of a single individual. Clara, often using the unstable ground the men avoided. They found the remnants of the fire pit and the tally mark carved into the stolen hatchet. 17 marks, 17 men. The revelation of the tactics was slow, painful, and deeply unsettling. The swamp was filled with improvised weapons, sharpened bones placed along known deer trails, tripwires made of sinew that deflected rifles into the mud, and a complex system of submerged logs that steered the men directly into the deep bog where the Jenkins brothers died. Clara had not only known the terrain, she had weaponized every inch of it, turning natural obstacles into lethal assets. The knowledge was too vast, too intimate for someone classified merely as property. Where did a woman, marked by the scars of brutal forced labor, learn the art of tactical ambush and psychological warfare? Decades of surviving the deep bayous during forced labor periods, years spent anticipating the movements of the overseer, the innate, desperate need to know every hiding spot, every escape route, that accidental training had forged a lethality far surpassing the formal military training of Vance and his men. She had transformed the landscape of her oppression into the theater of their demise. The tally mark confirmed it. It wasn't a moment of rage. It was a planned cleansing. She didn't run, Hale finally breathed out, staring into the silent, unforgiving swamp. She invited them in. The trail abruptly ended at a wide, slow-moving stretch of brackish water, known locally as the River Styx. The deeper search teams found the remaining 14 members of the larger KKK group scattered over the next 48 hours, killed with the same systematic precision, but spread out, suggesting Clara had continued her campaign of elimination after destroying Vance's main patrol, sweeping the back trails for stragglers and reinforcements. The number of dead was now 31. She was not satisfied with escape. She was intent on absolute eradication. Clara, the freed woman, the reaper of the Low Country, was never captured. The subsequent hunt failed entirely. Experienced trackers refused to follow the trail beyond the River Styx, muttering darkly about the silence of the swamp. 2 of the remaining bloodhounds brought in for the pursuit died mysteriously, poisoned, the reports claimed, by swamp water, but the signs suggested a quick professional application of concentrated toxin. The official records were immediately falsified. The reports claimed a deadly skirmish with rogue unionists or deaths by natural swamp hazards, but the truth traveled like marsh fire through the segregated quarters and remote settlements. Whispers gave her a new name, the Delta Shadow. In the taverns of the nearby towns, new bounty hunters and clansmen were warned about the area, now deemed cursed. The fear generated by those 17 precise, cold executions and the subsequent 14 was greater than any terror they could inflict. They had hunted a ghost and found a machine of absolute resistance. The resistance was not noble, it was absolute and terrifying. It was the brutal consequence of a system that believed it could mark, break, and own a human soul without consequence. The Delta Shadow proved the cost of that belief was measured in the cold count of dead men. If you seek more stories that the official history tried to bury, moments where those considered property transformed into the nightmares of their oppressors, where the resistance was not political but absolute and visceral, you must look past the polished monuments and into the muck where the real accounting took place. The air grew thick, not just with the humid press of the South Carolina swamp, but with the cloying, metallic sweetness of fresh slaughter. It was the afternoon of the reckoning, perhaps the 13th hour since Ilara had begun her impossible circuit. 57 was the number whispered later in federal inquiries, the total tally of those who vanished into the Low Country during the single terrifying 24-hour cycle of violence. But for the men currently slogging through the black water, a contingent of 23 Klansmen led by Major Thorne, that number was meaningless. Their immediate concern was the 7 missing men from their own ranks, swallowed whole by the cypress grove since dawn. They were in the heart of the Delta, where the sunlight fractured into sickly green shards and the ground offered no purchase, only slick, rotting vegetation and pools of water the color of strong tea. Every sound was magnified. Every snap of a twig beneath heavy boot leather seemed a declaration of location. Major Thorne, a man whose arrogance was rivaled only by his certainty in his own military competence, spat into the stagnant water. "It's just luck," he grated, his voice hoarse from shouting commands the swamp instantly absorbed. "A freed woman running scared. She set a few crude traps. We got careless." His second, a squat man named Silas, who carried the reputation of the best slave catcher between Charleston and Augusta, shook his head slowly. Silas's eyes, usually sharp enough to read a deer's trajectory from a faint scrape of dew, were troubled. "Sir, luck don't break a man's neck with a tripwire set 3 feet off the ground," Silas murmured, his gaze sweeping the vertical landscape of roots and moss. "And luck don't leave a man's knife plunged so deep into a tree the handle is flush with the bark. She ain't running, she's luring." Indeed, the remaining men were grouped tightly, their white hoods soiled and damp, transforming their intended symbol of purity into sodden shrouds. They carried rifles, Springfields, and old muzzle-loaders, and coils of chain, heavy instruments of torture and fear. Now those chains felt like unnecessary weight, reminders of a system of control that had abruptly collapsed under the weight of one woman's resolve. The next death was soundless. A heavy, middle-aged farmer named Rourke, walking third from the rear, simply ceased moving. When the men ahead paused, they found Rourke slumped forward, his face buried in the muddy bank. Initially, they thought stroke or exhaustion. When Silas rolled the body over, the truth was revealed in the impossible precision of the wound. Rourke's throat had been severed, swiftly and completely, but without excessive mess. The wound was not jagged or torn by a rough blade, but carved with the surgical efficiency of a well-honed razor. Ilara had moved past him, executed him instantly, and slipped back into the cover, all while the party was standing barely 10 feet away, arguing about their direction. The discovery of Rourke's death broke the hubris, but the true shattering blow came 2 hours later when they located the body of Cyrus, the man who had vanished just after the second missing report. They found him elevated, 30 feet up in the canopy of an ancient cypress tree. He was trussed like game, suspended by his own boot leather high above the water. He was entirely drained. Not a single drop of blood stained the rough bark beneath the dangling corpse. Major Thorne stared up, his military discipline cracking like dry timber. "How in God's name?" "She used his knife," Silas whispered, pointing. The keen edge of Cyrus's hunting knife was wedged into the trunk, scoring a perfect circle at the level of the man's eyes. "And she didn't just kill him, Major. She displayed him. This ain't a fight for survival. This is a message." The clansmen were now 15. The fear became tangible, mixing with the metallic swamp odor. They were moving from hunters to targets. The second wave of eliminations was faster, more personal, less dependent on stationary traps. Ilara was actively engaging, striking from the flanks, using the very humidity and shadow that choked the men as her camouflage. The tactics shifted from fatal accidents to psychological assaults. A man named Dale vanished while trying to cross a narrow, submerged log. Moments later, the log itself was found, mysteriously moved 20 feet downstream, wedged firmly across the trail, blocking their retreat. On it was Dale's hood, meticulously cleaned of mud, folded into a neat square, weighted down by a single polished river stone. The surviving men began to see her. They would catch impossible glimpses. A flicker of movement behind the silver-gray curtain of Spanish moss, a shadow that moved too fast to be human, too solid to be spectral. She never appeared clearly, but the impression was overwhelming. A figure of impossible physical efficiency, her form hardened by a lifetime of forced labor, now weaponized by absolute hatred. Her eyes, when glimpsed, were what destroyed their nerve. They held not the frenzy of vengeance, but the chilling vacancy of a craftsman focused entirely on the task at hand. The remaining squad began to fracture. They were too scared to move alone, yet too paranoid to trust those around them. "She's leading us in circles," one man, Jeb, yelled, grabbing his rifle. "We should cut north, get to the ridge." "We follow the Major," Thorne roared back, but his voice lacked conviction. Jeb and Harlan, terrified, abandoned the group, cutting into the thick underbrush, aiming for what they believed was safety. Ilara did not follow them immediately. Instead, a few minutes after their hurried departure, a sound emerged from the swamp, low and unnervingly close. The wet, choking gasp of a struggling animal, followed by a heavy splash that suggested a large body had hit the water. It was a sound designed to panic. An hour later, Thorne's group found Jeb and Harlan's bodies 20 yards apart. They had not been killed by Ilara. Both bore bullet wounds from the same caliber weapon, fired at close range. In their fear and the oppressive darkness of the moss canopy, they had mistaken each other for the predator and executed one another. Ilara had spent nothing but a single, carefully timed splash. The remaining 10 men looked at each other, their faces grey beneath the grime. They were not fighting a fugitive, they were fighting their own minds, manipulated by a genius of terror. Thorne finally lowered his rifle, the weight of the impossible realization settling upon him like the humid air. He looked at the vast, featureless marshland, the thousands of identical cypress knees, the endless, claustrophobic expanse of dark water and tangled root. "It was not an escape," he stated, the words dry and rasping. "It never was." The surviving tracker, Silas, looked at his commander, waiting. "It was a siege," Thorne concluded, his voice barely audible above the hum of insects. She had turned 40 square miles of unforgiving marshland into a personal slaughterhouse. And we, the 23 of us, armed and supposedly trained, we had walked in willingly. The last phase was not a chase. It was an execution schedule. The 8 remaining clansmen ceased all pretense of hunting. They formed a tight, desperate knot around a small rise of dry land. Paralyzed, their rifles pointed outward into the endless gloom, waiting for the attack they now knew was inevitable. Ilara abandoned the subtle approach entirely. The assault began with terrifying speed, less than a minute after Thorne's chilling realization. The first sound was the thwack of a stone striking wood, a distraction. As 3 men spun their weapons toward the noise, Ilara burst from the moss directly behind the remaining 5. She moved low, impossibly fast, a blur of motion only visible by the sudden displacement of the stagnant air. A heavy Bowie knife, one stolen earlier from Rourke, flashed. It was not thrown. It was driven with shocking force beneath the jaw of the nearest man, Carter. The sound was a damp, sickening thud. Carter went down instantly, his rifle falling harmlessly into the mud. Before the next man, Jenkins, could raise his sights, Ilara was on him. She used the weight of Carter's falling body as momentum, sweeping Jenkins' legs out from under him. As he collapsed, she snatched his dropped rifle. The rifle was empty. Thorne had insisted they conserve powder. But Ilara didn't need ammunition. She used the rifle stock as a club, swinging the heavy wood in a tight, vertical arc. The blow connected with Jenkins' temple. The sound was precise, like a short, sharp knock on a thick door. Jenkins' head snapped violently, and he lay still. 3 men down in under 10 seconds. The remaining 5 fired wildly into the shadows, wasting their precious rounds. Ilara was already gone, melting back into the impenetrable curtain of moss, leaving behind the immediate suffocating stench of gunpowder and panic. She began picking them off one by one, using their own terror against them. A man named Billy thought he saw her move and ran toward the thickest cover. He was met not by Ilara, but by a tripwire that swung a heavy iron skillet, stolen from an abandoned hunting shack, directly into his face, shattering his nasal bones and knocking him senseless. Ilara emerged, used a short length of chain to finish him quickly, and vanished with the skillet. The group dwindled to 3: Major Thorne, Silas the Tracker, and a young man named Emmett. Emmett broke first. He screamed, dropping his rifle and turning to run blindly towards the south. He ran for less than 50 feet before a primitive but devastatingly effective garrote, woven from 2 strands of piano wire she must have retrieved from some ruined parlor in a burned plantation house, snapped taut around his ankles. He fell face first into the water. Ilara did not approach him. She simply watched, unseen, as Emmett drowned, paralyzed by the pain in his ankles and the shock of the fall. His thrashing stopped within a minute. Thorne and Silas stood alone, back to back, the last remnants of the hunt. "Silas, you see her?" Thorne whispered, desperation carving lines into his face. "She's everywhere, Major," Silas breathed. "She brought us here. This is where she lives." Silas, the acclaimed tracker, finally understood that all of Ilara's movements had been a pre-calculated vector, leading them to this specific spot. A bottleneck formed by a cluster of ancient, half-rotted cypress stumps. The end for Silas was swift and structural. He heard a faint creak above him, a sound utterly distinct from the usual rustling of the swamp. He looked up, his eyes widening in the split second of understanding. Ilara had been working on a rotten log for hours, perhaps days, patiently preparing its fall. He cried out, but the warning was too late. A massive, waterlogged cypress limb, weighing nearly a ton, fell with a horrifying crash, released by a single, final cut she had made with Rourke's knife. It struck Silas square on the shoulders and pinned him instantly to the earth, crushing his spine and extinguishing his life in a burst of air and blood. Major Thorne stood alone. Ilara stepped into the clearing. She was not running now, nor was she concealed. She stood maybe 15 feet away, backlit by the faint, filtered sunlight. Her face was smudged with mud and grime, her simple cotton dress torn in several places, but her posture was straight. She carried no rifle, only the heavy iron skillet in her right hand and a 3-foot length of rusting chain taken from a planter's shed, wrapped around her left forearm. Thorne raised his Springfield rifle, his hands shaking violently, the iron sight blurring. He fired once. A miss, the bullet whistling harmlessly into the dark bark of the tree behind her. He fumbled desperately for his powder horn, trying to reload. Ilara did not rush. She walked forward slowly, purposefully, forcing Thorne to watch her approach. She moved with a terrible, unhurried grace. Thorne dropped the rifle. He drew his old Confederate saber, a useless relic against this enemy, but the last symbol of his shattered authority. "You're just a goddamn animal!" he screamed, his voice dissolving into a pathetic whine. "Your property!" Ilara said nothing. She approached, not engaging the saber but observing it. When she was within 6 feet, she extended the chain, not to strike, but to snag. The chain wrapped around the thin blade of the saber. With a swift, powerful yank, she tore the weapon from his grasp. It flew into the muck. Thorne was disarmed, stripped of his dignity and his power. He stood there, a tall, shaking man in a filthy white hood, defenseless. He looked into her eyes. There was no hatred there, only the absolute cold detachment of a reckoning long overdue. Ilara raised the iron skillet, the tool of a domestic life brutally interrupted, now forged into a heavy, devastating weapon. She did not strike his head or his heart. She brought the skillet down repeatedly, with steady, unyielding force, targeting his hands and forearms, methodically shattering the bones and rendering him utterly incapable of resistance, forcing him to understand his own vulnerability before the final, extinguishing blow. The silence that followed the last wet crack was more deafening than the screams that had preceded it. It was the silence of 57 separate debts paid in full within a single day. The swamp, for the first time in 24 hours, stopped breathing. The reckoning was complete. The bodies of the 23 men lay scattered across the 10-acre clearing, a gruesome mosaic of systemic elimination. The executioner was gone. The reaper had finished her harvest. The sun began its slow descent, leaving the swamp to steep in the new, terrible truth. The discovery and the chilling analysis of the impossible feat would wait for the arrival of the dawn and the new patrol sent to find the missing. The cypress knees were slick with a grease that was not mud. It was the residue of the last hour, spread thick and dark upon the marsh floor where the final men of the patrol had attempted to make their stand. They were 5 now, huddled around the skeletal remnants of a raised hunting blind, a structure built for observing quiet death, now serving as a final pathetic fortress against it. The air was a heavy soup of sulfur, rot, and the metallic tang of fresh, hot hemoglobin that had not yet cooled in the humidity. Terror had melted the last vestiges of their discipline. They were not clansmen. They were just men waiting for the sound of a movement that never quite arrived. They kept their rifles pointed at the impenetrable wall of moss and fog, knowing the bullets were wasted, knowing the threat was already inside the perimeter of their minds. A low, sucking sound, like a foot pulled quickly from thick mud, drew their attention toward the east. They fired raggedly into the mist. Nothing, only the echo returning, mocking their noise. The 5th man, a stocky planter named Hollis, wept silently, his wet breath hitching. He raised his heavy Sharps rifle, intending to shoot himself rather than face the silence. Before he could pull the trigger, the mist parted right next to him. Not dissipating, but pulled aside. It was the shadow. Not fast, not sudden, but simply there. Hollis didn't scream. He gasped, the air rupturing in his lungs as the honed steel edge, a tool, perhaps a sharpened cane cutter or a repurposed scythe blade, came down with the practiced efficiency of a blacksmith's hammer strike. It cleaved through the collarbone, severing the connection between the neck and shoulder, a perfect, brutal cut that dropped him where he stood, the sharps clattering uselessly in the gore. The reaper, defined only by the bulk of her silhouette against the false dawn, moved into the blind space Hollis had occupied. She used the sound of Hollis's body hitting the floor as cover for her own steps, already closing the distance to the next man, Ramsey. Ramsey tried to turn the heavy rifle, but panic had turned his movements into slow molasses. He was too late. She used the butt of his own rifle against the side of his head. Not a random blow, but an extinction. The sound was flat, wet, and final, the immediate cessation of motor function. Ramsey's body slumped against the wooden supports, already dead before the executioner's blade found the soft place beneath his jaw, ensuring the silence. 3 remained. Colonel Silas, the leader, his Lieutenant Davies, and a young, inexperienced farmhand named Boyd. Boyd cracked first. He dropped his rifle and scrambled away from the blind, plunging into the thickest part of the swamp, convinced the thickness would hide him. It did not. The reaper did not pursue him immediately. She did not need to. She had prepared the landscape meticulously. Boyd ran 10 feet before his foot caught in a tripwire made of taut, aged vine. He fell forward onto a nest of jagged, fire-hardened wooden spikes she had buried just beneath the waterline hours earlier. The spikes, repurposed fence posts, sharpened to obsidian points, pierced him through the abdomen and ribs. His shriek was immediate, raw, and cut the heavy swamp air like glass. The scream served as the final psychological weapon. Silas and Davies, hearing the prolonged, agonizing sound of Boyd struggling, abandoned the blind. They ran in opposite directions, not caring about cover or strategy, only distance. Davies made it 50 yards. He crossed a narrow stream, thinking the water would wash away his scent. The reaper was waiting, crouched in the shade of a massive, dripping, weeping willow. She emerged without a splash, a phantom of the water. Davies saw her too late, a dark figure of impossible strength and silence. The confrontation was less than 3 seconds. Davies raised his pistol. She deflected the shot with her forearm, the heavy leather padding she wore absorbing the impact. Before Davies could cock the hammer again, she closed the distance, her free hand finding his throat. The execution was swift and crushing. a technique learned not from military manuals, but from the brutal necessity of slaughtering livestock for survival, pinning the head, twisting the neck with sudden, terrifying torque. The bone gave with a sharp, sickening snap that was audible even over the panicked pounding of Silas's retreat. Now, only Silas remained, the leader, the man who had organized the patrol, who had laughed about the easy hunt, who had assured his men that the property was nothing more than a frightened animal. Silas did not run far. He collapsed next to a massive, submerged log, his expensive boots already ruined by the caustic swamp water. He was breathing in painful, shallow gasps, his vision blurred by fear and sweat. He still clutched his sidearm, but his hand trembled too violently to aim. The Reaper stepped into the small clearing. She dropped Davies's body soundlessly into the black water. She approached Silas not with rage, but with the cold, measured patience of a debt collector. Silas looked up at her, finally seeing her clearly. Her face was smeared with mud and shadows, her eyes wide, black, and completely empty of any human emotion, just the reflection of the swamp's darkness. He saw the strength in her shoulders, the impossible size of her frame, built not by weights, but by decades of unrelenting forced labor under the subtropical sun. He saw the scars crossing her knuckles and the deep old welts marring her throat. He saw the history of his own people etched into her skin. "Wait," Silas whispered, his voice thin and reedy. "We can talk. I have land, I have money. I'll give you a pass. You'll be free." The Reaper did not react. She merely observed the weapon in his hand. Then, with a sudden fluid movement that belied her bulk, she kicked the pistol out of his grasp. It splashed into the shallow water. She did not kill him immediately. She stood over him, forcing him to look at her, forcing him to recognize the instrument of his annihilation. It was a calculated cruelty, the final systemic reversal. She reached down, not for her own weapon, but for the broken, tarnished sickle she had taken from the first clansman's belt 20 hours earlier. It was stained black, the edge polished smooth by constant use and continuous cleaning. Silas choked on his terror. "Who are you?" Her voice, when it came, was a low, rusty sound, rarely used, devoid of any dialect or accent, just a statement of fact, a confirmation of the inevitable cycle she represented. 57, she stated. Then the sickle came down. It was not a chop, but a surgical removal, striking with such force and precision that the deed was done before Silas's brain could register the pain. The sound was the loud, distinct thwack of meat being separated from bone, echoing briefly, then swallowed immediately by the oppressive humidity. Silence returned, an immense, heavy, anti-natural silence. The hunt was over. The 24-hour cycle was complete. 3 days later, the search party arrived. Sheriff Beaumont led them, accompanied by a small contingent of the newly formed Federal Bureau of Investigation, led by Marshal Hayes, a man sent down from the north specifically to document and suppress the rising tide of organized racial terrorism following the war. They had been drawn by the complete failure of the initial massive patrol to return. 57 men gone, disappeared into the swamps around Sandy Creek. Beaumont had expected a botched ambush, a mass desertion, or perhaps a fierce gun battle with rival gangs. He found none of that. What they found was a slaughterhouse arranged with grim, logistical efficiency. The first bodies were discovered near the perimeter of the territory the freed woman had commandeered. 3 men caught in rudimentary yet devastating deadfall traps. Logs weighted with rock, released by tripwires hidden in the Spanish moss. Their skulls were crushed clean. The wounds suggested not accident, but an understanding of physics and pressure far beyond common knowledge. As they pressed deeper, the pattern became brutally clear. The deaths were spaced out, each execution serving a function. First, to silence a threat. Second, to break the morale of the survivors. Third, to guide the patrol toward the pre-selected kill zones. Marshal Hayes, accustomed to the brutality of war and the chaos of Reconstruction violence, grew steadily quieter. He noted the details with a clinical horror. The number: 57 bodies spread over approximately 40 square miles of unforgiving marshland. Every member of the original KKK patrol was accounted for. The sequence: it was clear who died first, the confident scouts taken out by silent snares, and who died last, the leaders saved for moments of maximum psychological impact.
The weapons. Rifles were recovered, but nearly all were empty, broken, or uselessly clogged with mud. The majority of the wounds were inflicted by improvised weaponry: fire-hardened wooden spikes, sharpened farming implements, heavy stones used with crushing force, and, most frequently, deep, clean lacerations, suggesting a blade used with extraordinary strength and training. The impossibility. The time frame. Beaumont argued it must have taken a week.
Hayes countered, pointing to the decomposition rate in the humid air and the pattern of blood coagulation. All evidence pointed to a sustained, continuous 24-hour operation. One person, 57 targets. They reached the final clearing, the site where Colonel Silas and the last few had fallen. The hunting blind was stained dark. Boyd was found skewered on the sharpened wood, his face a mask of protracted agony. Davies was submerged nearby, neck snapped clean. Silas was the central fixture. He lay prone, the sickle lying beside his body. Hayes knelt, examining the wound. A perfect severance. It was an execution. "She disarmed him first," Hayes murmured, tracing the faint marks of the struggle near where the pistol was found. "She wanted him to see it coming. She wanted him to know who delivered it." Beaumont, sweating heavily despite the cooling shade, shook his head, staring at the chaotic pile of dead men who had been his neighbors. "It wasn't a human fight, Marshal. It was an animal doing, a frenzy." Hayes looked around the swamp, the oppressive silence seeming to settle over them. "A frenzy is messy, Sheriff. This is mathematics. This is architecture. Look at the bodies. Not one man here died fighting an equal. They died because the terrain was her partner, and they walked into a machine they didn't know existed." The investigators began to piece together the closed loops that had tormented the hunters. The knowledge. The freed woman had worked this specific land for over 40 years. She knew every soft patch, every submerged log, every hidden path through the tall reeds. Where the clansmen saw an obstacle, she saw an arsenal. Where they saw darkness, she saw clarity. The preparation. Hayes discovered small caches of supplies, watertight gourds, sharpened blades wrapped in oilcloth, dried jerky, hidden strategically along the main paths. She had spent weeks, perhaps months, preparing for the inevitable rupture, transforming the swamp into a fortress and a killing field long before the KKK ever set foot there. The physicality. The unbelievable strength and speed were not supernatural, but the horrifying result of the system of chattel slavery. Decades of heavy manual labor, malnutrition, and surviving chronic pain had forged a body capable of absorbing tremendous punishment and delivering surgical violence. She was a biological weapon, tempered by forced endurance. Hayes realized the devastating truth that redefined the event. This wasn't a struggle for survival. It was a planned extermination event. The patrol was the executioner's resource, delivering themselves one by one to the predetermined location. The aftermath was silence and distortion. No trace of the freed woman was ever found. The search continued for weeks, led by increasingly fearful posses. The bloodhounds, the famed tracking dogs of the Low Country, refused to enter the specific zone of the massacre. They whined, choked, and often died mysteriously in the area, leading locals to declare the marsh irrevocably cursed. The official records were immediately falsified. Marshal Hayes's detailed report vanished into the bureaucratic depths of Washington. Sheriff Beaumont filed a statement claiming the 57 Klansmen had died in a massive, internecine gun battle over confiscated arms. A plausible, if grotesque, lie designed to save the face of the nascent Reconstruction government and prevent widespread panic. But the truth, raw and dark, survived. In the cabins and back alleys of South Carolina, a new name was whispered, a name that replaced the fear of the Klan for a different, colder dread: the Reaper. She became a silent symbol, a vengeful spirit that proved resistance when absolute was possible. Stories circulated of a shadow figure still roaming the low country, of strange, quick deaths of tax collectors and particularly cruel overseers in areas far from Sandy Creek. They said she had fled north, or perhaps deeper into the territory of the Seminole, where the law held no sway. Others said she had simply dissolved back into the mud and water that had sustained her. The impact on the local clans was immediate and profound. Recruitment dropped drastically in the surrounding counties. No patrol of less than 100 men dared enter the Sandy Creek territory for a generation. It had become a forgotten, dangerous pocket on the map, marked not by physical boundaries, but by the memory of 57 bodies retrieved in silence. The system of oppression had momentarily encountered a force equal to its own brutality, a force it had unwittingly engineered and then fatally underestimated. The 24-hour Reaper was more than a massacre. It was a devastating lesson carved into the landscape of the South, a dark, necessary legend, ensuring that the true history of resistance, the history that official documents attempt to bury and silence, would survive in the fearful whispers of the powerful and the secret hopes of the oppressed. If you seek more stories that the history official attempted to bury, moments where the considered property transformed into the nightmares of their executioners, where the resistance was not noble, but absolute and terrifying, subscribe and listen closely. We lift the lid on the forgotten brutality.